How do children learn languages? Part 2, Module 1, Unit 3. The wild one. So what would happen if you lost your baby in the jungle and she was raised by gorillas? Imagine it. You go on a safari. Your child is just a baby, 1-year-old. Maybe you're in the back of the Jeep. All of a sudden, this big gorilla, look at him, comes up, grabs your baby, and runs off into the jungle. 4 years later, they find your baby. And what language will she speak? Well, of course, you know that the answer is she couldn't speak. And if we think about this from the perspectives of different linguistic theories, Skinner would say that she needed imitation, repetition, and reinforcement. And Chomsky would say that she didn't have access to input, so couldn't activate her innate grammar acquiring capacity. That's universal grammar. Others, they would say she needed to make connections through general learning or interactions. Or maybe she just missed a critical period for language learning or language acquisition. Let's look at some of these ideas here. First one is Skinner again. So how does Skinner claim we learn complex language? Say it with me: by imitation, repetition, and reinforcement. We start with a blank slate for language learning where the behavior, all the language learning behavior is learned. There's nothing in there in advance. Chomsky, of course, slams Skinner with his theory of universal grammar. Skinner fails to explain the complexity and freedom of mental life. And Skinner says, ouch, right? So what is UG? It's this idea that we have a biologically innate grammar acquiring capacity. That's a mouthful, but it's a good definition of UG, so please try to remember it. We have a biologically innate grammar acquiring capacity. So Chomsky would say, we cannot predict verbal behavior in terms of the stimuli in the speaker's environment, since we do not know what the current stimuli are until he responds. That is, we don't know what people will say because they respond freely to many stimuli, and we don't know what stimuli will come to us. So behaviorism is not complicated enough. It's language acquisition, language learning, language production. Using language is more complicated than just stimulus plus response. So just how complex is language? Well, my professor at the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Simon Kirby, and his colleague Christensen say that language is infinitely flexible and almost universally present. It is by far the most complex behavior that we know of. The most complex behavior that we know of. That's from Christensen and Kirby, The Hardest Problem in Science. So does this complexity require some sort of innate mechanism where we have a program in our brains already that we're born with that helps us learn language? Well, that's what Chomsky will say. Chomsky says we make new sentences and combinations using rules, not imitation, and that kids have this general design of language pre-wired in their brains. They have the rules in their brains pre-wired. They're born knowing some kind of language rules. They know in advance what the rules of language look like. They have this biologically innate grammar acquiring capacity, and that has some kind of rule orientation in the brain that helps us acquire language. It's universal grammar, not a blank slate. But what if Chomsky and Skinner are both wrong, and some people say they are, the connectionists say so. So here is a simple definition of connectionism from Lightbound and Spada. I'll read it to you. The more often units of language are heard or seen together, the more likely it is that the presence of one will lead to the activation of the other. Translation: we meet bits of language together. So A and B come paired, they come together. So when we see A, the brain activates B. So when one of the bubbles in this web is touched, it causes other bubbles to move. Good example, I think. So connectionists disagree with Chomsky and friends. They say that we acquire language by general learning, not UG. Brains get inputs. Brains make networks. More inputs make connections stronger. So this is the idea of connectionism. So the idea of connectionism says it's not a language organ. So like we have a heart beating I have a heart beating in my chest, and Chomsky's kind of claiming that language is like an organ, like a heart, and the connectionists say it's not like an organ. It's a general learning mechanism. Input gives you everything you need, and we make connections. So try to finish these sentences. 2 heads are better than. You know the answer. 2 heads are better than 1. If you speak Japanese, you probably know how to finish this sentence. 3人よれば文殊の知恵, which is a rough translation or a rough pair to the 2 heads are better than 1. So let's look at connectionism versus universal grammar. Chomsky, UG, and input. So Chomsky would say we don't get enough input and grammar is too complex, so we need an internal mechanism. Grammar is way too complex. Hardly very many people can explain grammar to us. So it's too complex to learn by ourselves. We need an internal, biologically innate mechanism to help us acquire language. But the connectionists say about input that we get enough input and our general learning ability helps us make the connections we need to make. Well, there's another problem, and it's the problem of the critical period. The guys who promote the critical period hypothesis say that language acquisition occurs during a critical period, or more softly stated, a sensitive period. So do we stop innately acquiring language at puberty? When we become junior high school kids? Do we stop innate learning and start just learning by study? Can older learners draw on universal grammar? So we say, I'm too old to learn language, often people say, but kids learn it so naturally. Is that because there's a critical period? And then does language only become this big intellectual puzzle? Is there like a line that we cross where it becomes too difficult to learn language? Well, these are important questions to ask, but the evidence for critical period is hard to prove. Maybe there's a sensitive period, but if you think about it, maybe the most important thing is time. An 18-year-old native speaker, by the time she is 18, might have 50,000 hours of native language input. Whereas if you're studying language at school, the amount of input is much, much less. Maybe by the time you're 18, 2,000 hours. If you, for example, study English in Japan, that's about how much you would get. So critical period aside, how much time are people getting with input and output with the language? And I think that's even more important, especially for applied linguistics, than the idea of a critical period. So in this short talk, you can see that there are many competing theories, and I haven't covered them all. We can see behaviorism competing with universal grammar, this idea of the critical period hypothesis, connectionism. I didn't talk about interaction. And so what we need is a unified theory, and I propose one at elemental-linguistics.com. Check it out. Thank you for listening.